Hello, I am glad to speak to you on the patent regime under TRIPS. TRIPS, as you know, is an agreement of the WTO, is the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Now, before TRIPS, the countries were free to decide their own patent policies. And India was one of those countries who took advantage of that and did a major reforms of the patent in the 1970s. What TRIPS basically has done is to make it compulsory for all WTO member countries to provide for patent protection for both products and processes in all fields of technology, including pharmaceuticals. So what we do in our discussion today, we have three parts. In the first part, I discuss the background, the situation before TRIPS, especially with reference to India. Then we discuss the impact of TRIPS, and then lastly, in the light of the possible negative consequences, what policies the governments of developing countries may adopt. Now, why India is important is that before 1972, India actually provided for product patent protection in pharmaceuticals. In 1972, they abolished it. And basically, it was after the abolition that there was a remarkable growth of the pharmaceutical industry. Before 1972, when you had product patents, the multinational corporations who held the patents, they were not very keen to manufacture in the country. They were keen to, only use India as a market to export. And the Indian companies who were keen to manufacture, they could not because they were prevented because of the patent rights. In fact, there were many legal cases where the multinationals prevented the Indian companies from manufacturing. The result was the industry was underdeveloped, it was import dependent, and since those days in particular you had a lot of foreign exchange difficulties, the consumption also was constricted. What happened after 1972 when product patent protection was abolished in pharmaceuticals? There was a almost dramatic growth of the pharmaceutical industry. Given the background of entrepreneurship, given the public sector labs that we had, given the fact that we had a history of public sector manufacturing, all these different things combined, we are not going to details, resulted in a remarkable growth. The result was that within a decade or so, India became self-sufficient, and right now India is a supplier of quality low-cost drugs to the entire world, not only to developing countries but also to developed countries. In fact, India attracted huge international attention in the context of these ARVs, the antiretrovirals, which are used for treating HIV/AIDS. Now, these medicines, the ARVs, they are patent protected, and in developed countries they are charged at a very high price. But despite the high price, people could afford or could use that. And as a result, the HIV/AIDS crisis became manageable in the developed countries. But in the developing countries, the prices were so high that, practically access was not there. In fact, to give an example, if you take the most widely used triple therapy, consisting of one stavudine, lamivudine, and neferripine, the cost initially was more than $10,000 per person per year. And it was only after the Indian generic competition started that gradually the prices fell, and right now it is available at less than $100 per person per year. Okay, so that is the background. So now, since India is now a major supplier of essential medicines, including ARVs, now naturally the apprehension has been expressed that after TRIPS, what will happen? And that will be our second part. Now, to discuss the impact of TRIPS, it is important to mention that actually product patents in pharmaceuticals can be of different types. It can be for the new chemical entity that is developed and patented, but it can also be for secondary patents on new formulations using the same chemical entity, or new combinations, or a new chemical derivative, a salt, and so on. Let me give you two examples, and that will make it clear because we will be using the example later. One is, this very widely used drug called Kaletra by Abbott. It's used as an ARV. Now, the basic chemicals are ritonavir and liponavir. So there are patents on these. But there is also a patent on a heat resistant formulation, okay, which Abbott also has patented. So therefore you have not only patent on the chemical, but you also have the patent on this formulation. Similarly, you take another very widely used ARV called TDF, tenofovir disoproxil fumarate. Now the basic chemical, tenofovir, you had a patent of that. But then there was again another patent on a salt of it, and that is what, tenofovir disoproxil fumarate is. And there are some complications with that. I will come to that later. But to discuss the impact, let us concentrate right now only on the new chemical entity. Okay, so what will happen? Now to discuss the impact, we have to make a distinction between three periods. One before 1995, between 1995 and 2005, and after 2005. Now the date is important because, while TRIPS came into effect with WTO in 1995, for countries like India, which had product patent, did not have product patent at that time, they were given time till 2005 to implement it. So they need not introduce product patent protection till 2005 January, 1st January, but they had to start this mailbox facility where any product patent applications will have to be accepted and stored, and which will be taken up only after 2005. Now for any new chemical entity patented before 1995, there will be no impact in India. WTO doesn't require that. So a chemical entity, say patented in 1994, it normally takes about 8 to 10 years to develop it for the market. Maybe coming to the market in, say, a few years back. So it is a new drug, but Indian firms can continue to produce it because the patent is before 1995. So new chemical entity before 1995, there is no problem. Similarly, just the opposite in fact, after 2005, any new chemical entity that is developed, Indians cannot produce, and therefore there will be implication which we will discuss. But what is important is this period between 1995 and 2005. There were product patent applications, but these were confidential. It was not published, so nobody knew what was there in the mailbox. And therefore, take this case: somebody has applied for a patent application, but an Indian firm, not knowing it, has already started producing it. Now, after 2005, when it is taken up and the patent is granted, then what happens to this particular firm? And here, what has happened in India, that it was decided that in such cases, the Indian firms can continue to produce, but they will have to give royalties to the patent holder. Okay, so let us forget about this in between thing, but the implication is clear. For any new chemical entity now being developed, there will be patents, and the companies which will have the patents, they will have monopoly rights, and they can prevent others from manufacturing. So unlike in the previous period before TRIPS, when Indian firms could develop processes for manufacturing drugs which were developed and patented abroad, Indian firms will no longer be able to do so. And therefore, naturally, we know that if there is monopoly, then there will be high price, and that is what is supposed to be the case. But here we should mention, because the multinationals say that though they would be having monopoly, the prices will actually not be beyond the reach, because they are claiming and they are saying that they have special programs for the needs of the poor countries. And in fact, it is true that some of the multinationals have announced such special programs, for example, in anti-cancer drugs or in ARVs. But if you see the details of what actually happens, you will find the most important thing, the multinationals are not taking responsibility for ensuring that everybody gets access. What they are doing, they are only announcing a special price. And if you see what is happening, you will find that very often, ultimately, though the price announced is quite low, the drugs are not reaching to the people because of a variety of reasons. One very simple reason is, very often they don't even get it registered in the country. Okay, so obviously if you don't register it, you don't get the drug. Then in many cases, they exclude some of the richer developing countries. They make it only for the least developed countries. But there are so many poor people even in the other developing countries. And very often that is excluded. But the important point I want to tell you is this, that even when you have these special programs, it can be empirically shown that the prices have been really low when there has been generic competition. Okay, like I can give you the example of this Abbott's Collectra, which I told you. Now, initially, Abbott announced a price of $500 per person per year for the least developed countries, and for other countries it was supposed to be negotiable. And it was found that the prices for other countries were very high, often 10 times of that. Then recently, when they developed this yeast-resistant formulation, now for the least developed countries it is still $500 per person per year. But now they have announced a price of $2,200 for other developing countries. But what is very interesting is this, that after Cipla and Indian Farm started manufacturing it and started offering it at a lower price, Abbott has further reduced the price. The point that I am trying to highlight is this, that ultimately even the price that the multinationals are offering, that in a sense is dependent on the generic competition. My apprehension is, in future, when such competition will not be there because there will be patents, it will have to be at the mercy of the multinationals. If they charge low price, it is affordable. If they don't, it is not affordable. And if history is any guide, then I would presume that in fact prices will be very high. Okay, so if prices are very high, then what do we do? So we come to the third part of the lecture. Now, first is, I would say that two things which should be done. First, see what can be done within WTO, and then also think what can be done outside WTO. I think both are important. First, let us discuss what can be done within WTO. You see, WTO agreement, the TRIPS agreement, has actually made it very clear that they are not only after the interests of the patent holders, but they will also have to look after the interests of the technology users. And in fact, the Article 7 and 8, let us not go into details of that, mentions about all this. I will discuss two flexibility which is available under WTO. One is the compulsory licensing, another is the exemption of patents in some cases. Now, compulsory licensing is a license which can be given by the government without the permission of the patent holder, very often against their permission, against their wishes, under certain circumstances. Now, TRIPS agreement mentions some procedures which will have to be followed, but the procedures are not that difficult. You can really manage it properly. And therefore, one thing which the developing countries can do, if it is found that the patent protected prices are very high, then they can go for the compulsory licensing route. Of course, there is a problem about the countries which do not have the capacity, but there are countries which have the capacity, and something should be done to ensure that you have the supplies. But if you see the experience, you will find that most of the countries have not been really be able to use this flexibility of commercial licensing. Brazil has done it with some success. Thailand, Malaysia tend to do. But in general, the conclusion would be that at every point you will have to struggle to really implement a compulsory licensing provision. And the reason is actually very obvious. Multinationals don't want that, because actually if you have a very easy to use compulsory licensing, then it basically amounts to lack of patents. Of course, they have royalties, but royalties only how much? Will be 4%, 5%. And that is something which doesn't satisfy the multinationals. They are after big money. And therefore, what they will do, they will continue to, oppose this. And since very often the developed countries are supporting these giant multinationals, very frankly, unless the developing countries unite and put much more pressure, it will be difficult to have proper compulsory licensing provisions. So this is one thing which developing countries should do. They are after all the majority, and they should really try to ensure that this important flexibility under WTO, the developing countries are able to use. Okay, that is first point. Second, you have this exemptions of patents. Recall what we said, that patents can be of different types. Okay, and in fact, what TRIPS says is this, that patents will have to be there for anything which is new, involves an inventive step, and has industrial application. But these terms are not defined. And therefore, the argument is that the developing countries can use it in a way, interpret this in a way to limit the patents possible. And in fact, precisely that is what India has done. In the latest amendment, in 2005 when the new act was introduced. The situation in India is this, that any of the secondary patents are not patentable unless they differ significantly with respect to efficacy. Okay, and that has created a huge controversy. Now, let me give you the example of Novartis Gleevec, that is an anti-cancer drug. And here, basically, the initial chemical, the imatinib mesylate, is pre-1995. But what Novartis has applied for patent in India is a beta crystal form, a secondary, a derivative of the earlier molecule. So it falls into the category of, the secondary patents. And when it came up for examination, ultimately the patent office rejected it, and then they have gone to the High Court appealing it. So that case has not yet been settled. But the important issue is this, that if ultimately Novartis wins this case, then they will have monopoly rights over this drug, and therefore ultimately price will be what they will charge. Of course, they are claiming that they have many special programs, but we have to see what the patients are getting. Okay, and therefore this is a flexibility, because if ultimately India can prevail and India can deny this patent to Novartis, then to that extent there will be generic competition and this price will be affordable. Another very important case is one of the most important ARVs. It is called, as the example of this tenofovir disoproxil fumarate. It is sold by Gilead in the brand name of Virid. And there again the same thing, as I told you, that the basic tenofovir is pre-1995, but the salt, the TDF, that is after 1995. So when Gilead has applied for patent in India, now this has been opposed by several Indian companies and also by some public groups, and that decision is not yet known. But here again, if ultimately Gilead gets it, then it will be their monopoly, and ultimately price will be what they decide. But if Gilead doesn't get it, then generic companies like Cipla can produce it, and it will be much affordable. Okay, so that is a very important flexibility which should be there. Then the third thing I want to say, under TRIPS, the least developed countries, they are exempted from introducing the product patent protection till 2016. Now, despite that, many least developed countries have not changed their patent laws. There are some countries which have product patents. Now, under this new situation, they can change it, but they have not done it. So, what can be done, and that is something should be immediately done on an urgent basis, using the skills available in many developing countries like, say, India, Brazil, Thailand, Argentina, and so on. The least developed countries which do not have adequate manufacturing capacity, but which are not supposed to provide for patent protection, they can start developing that industry as India did earlier by not recognizing product patents. Lastly, I want to say something about the R&D. See, currently the problem is what? The multinationals mainly develop drugs. Of course, there is public sector investment in developed countries, but it is the multinationals who ultimately develop it for the market. And they claim that it's hugely costly, and therefore, unless they have patent product rights, it will not be worth their investment. But if you see the structure of the cost, you will find that, one of the most important is clinical trials. And again, there are other things like process development. And these clinical trials and process development, etc., can be done at a much cheaper price in developing countries. Okay, so therefore, why not try to think big and think of, R&D models without MNCs? Now, it may be too much for a particular developing country. But if, the different developing countries combined, unite, take different programs located in different centers, and therefore try to develop. They have their own clinical trials. They initially need not bother about the developed country markets, because you see, now the problem is, whenever you try to develop it for the developed countries market, as multinationals do, and as some Indian companies are trying to do, you have all these problems of, promoting the market, satisfying the US FDA, and that becomes very difficult. So like US FDA may not accept a clinical trial done in Kenya or India. But if the developing countries combine, if they have their own standards, they do not consider developed countries, they try to develop drugs for the developing countries, and try to upgrade the standards, then I don't see any reason why it cannot be done. And once you do this, once there are few success stories, the nature of the game can change. So I think you should not only try to do what you can do under the existing WTO, but we can also think beyond WTO and think of different models. Thank you.